Now, we should probably also talk about, in other news, the very tragic case of Elianne Andam, the 15-year-old girl who was fatally stabbed by a bus stop in Croydon last week. On Wednesday evening, we saw thousands of people come out and attend a vigil in Elianne's name. This is a truly, truly shocking case, and it really seems as if it has touched a nerve with so many people in a way that similar incidences haven't. And Luke, why do you think that is? Why Elianne in particular?
I don't know, because Elianne is not, I'm afraid, unique. She's certainly not the only person to have died in recent years because of hurt feelings. You know, we know in this case it looks as though the person arrested turned up with a bunch of roses and has reacted badly to being romantically rejected. It brought to mind for me the killing in 2018 of Harry Yakoza, a young man who was stabbed to death during a fight over a young woman. It was about her feelings. It was about self-esteem. And in 2018, I followed quite a lot of the cases, which, as you suggest, kind of flitted in and out of the news. And a lot of them were about hurt feelings. Time and time again, young people in our inner cities are getting drawn into violent confrontations over their emotions and over their feelings. And I think it's the thing that no one's talked about. We like to talk about this as though it's gang crime. The word that people use is gang crime. When you look at the detail, often these are just groups of young friends, predominantly, I'm afraid, Black and Asian young men in our inner cities, who think it is okay to kill over personal insult and personal affront. You know, Harry Yakoza was not the only one. You know, throughout that year, that 2018 was a particularly bad year for knife crime in London. Thankfully, it's dropped off to some extent in recent years. We've seen a reduction this year. It's not as violent as it was in 2018. But this problem is very real. And I think what we need to start doing is looking at the detailed circumstances behind each of these cases and see that often these are young men who see life as very cheap and see life as disposable and have nothing to counteract that narrative. And the other really important point to make is, I think what's not said often enough is how wider society, and particularly liberal, predominantly white commentators, have perhaps inadvertently provided a moral justification for these killings. Because I think we have too often given these young people the idea that their society is built against them, that society is structurally racist, that they have no possibility of advancing, that the police are against them, that the courts and legal system have been built to discriminate against them. And if you deeply hold those beliefs, if you deeply believe that following the law and following society's moral code has nothing for you, then perhaps violence is excusable. If you've grown up in a society that so openly loathes you, then violence does have at least an explanation. I think we need to reverse that narrative very, very urgently. We need to recognise that this is not a problem within the Black community, which is something we say often. It's a problem with our city communities. It's a problem, it's a civic problem. It's a breakdown of our civic engagement. And what I mean by that is we all should bear responsibility, those living in our cities, to give these young people a sense of meaning and purpose to their lives. I think we're failing to do that. And what we're doing instead is giving a horrible, blinkered moral justification to their actions. And I think it's tragic.
And wouldn't you say it's ironic that we live in an age where the political discussion is so often dominated by the slogan of Black Lives Matter? Mm-hmm. And, you know, on the face of it, it seems that we should be more dedicated than ever to solving the problems of racial inequality. And yet when it comes to things like crime, where it is often young Black teenagers who are most affected by it, we don't seem to want to tackle that. Why do you think this is such a politically uncomfortable topic? Why are we not seeing the same kind of urgency about solving this?
I think it's outrageous, and I think as Luke was gesturing to there and has written up about before, this blind spot is so profound, because if you think about the sort of discussions around racial inequality we have, it can be such trivial things which can often be around questions of hurt feelings, cultural appropriation, all of these kind of nonsense stuff which have become, rightly so, the subject of kind of tabloid mockery. They're so ridiculous. And yet when you talk about a profound racial inequality, like for instance the victims of teenage violent and sometimes lethal crime in a city like London, there's crickets. It amounts to a form of racist negligence at a certain point. And this is something that you see mirrored in America as well, with the flare-up of violent crime in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement there, as a consequence of ridiculous anti-policing measures which were not really very well thought through and even more poorly implemented. Because it's very easy for the commentariat to turn their backs away from this particular issue. It doesn't really affect them. They don't think of these people really deep down in a strange sort of way as their own, as members of their own community. And that's something which I think is makes it so important that we do confront it in the way and on the terms that Luke is talking about, to treat this as almost like a kind of sectional identity issue. It affects this community and not that other one, tells you something about how we got here in the first place. I am continually struck, and it's not a new point, about the paucity of the debate in this particular area. Because what I find it funny is that on the one hand, you have kind of liberal left commentators who will talk about how complicated it is. And it is very complicated. Luke, you've gestured to some of the factors there, this kind of culture of hurt feelings and self-esteem matched with various kind of socio-economic factors in relation to family structure, all different things which have been debated and reports have been written about. And yet they'll then often boil it down to the most absurd, politically salient points. So they'll say, for them, salient points. They'll say things like, of course, the old canard around its youth centres. The young gentleman who is alleged to have committed this nihilistic crime, if he had been able to play table tennis the night before in some church hall somewhere, he wouldn't have brought a zombie knife to school and stabbed an innocent young girl. This is absurd on the face of it, but all this stuff always gets repeated. And then what's been interesting is that, not least because of the fact this is the alleged perpetrator in this case was a young man, and obviously the victim was a young woman, that suddenly Andrew Tate makes its way into the conversation. The tabloid, the commentariat fodder of a couple of weeks ago, we can just map that on because we can talk about misogyny. We're very comfortable talking about these kinds of issues. So I am always very struck by the strange contrast between the seriousness of the problem, the urgency of the need to deal with it. Any society, any city which allows such nihilistic crime to become just a sort of background noise of city life. There aren't many cases of these, but any of them should horrify us. I think any city that allows that to happen, any society that allows that to happen, has completely lost the moral plot. And yet our discussion about it is either sort of silence or nonsense. And I don't know if this case can't shake people out of that, I don't know what will, really.
And wouldn't you say there is also this kind of blaming it on youth centres or blaming it on Andrew Tate? Doesn't that kind of strip agency away from these communities? They're kind of approaching this problem with a very resigned kind of fatalism, almost saying that, this stuff is out of our hands. We can't tackle it because it's because of misogyny, or it's because of structural racism, or it's because of budget cuts. But it's not as simple as that, is it?
Yeah, I think, look, Tom's right. When you look at the research, there is and how could there possibly be any evidential base for saying that knife crime is driven by the closure of youth centres? It would be completely bonkers. But this hints at a deeper point about how we discuss these particular young men. And it's effectively what we do is rob them of their agency. We don't think of them as human beings who make decisions about what they do and the trajectory of their lives. I think we see them predominantly as victims of society. And that's why we can say things like, well, this is all the fault of cuts or austerity, or it's all the fault of, pick your bogeyman, really. It's that sense of victimhood that robs these young people of their agency, the sense that they make the decisions and that they are the important players in their life. And I think that is where this nihilism comes from. It's telling that this constant referral to these young people have no choice but to act in the way that they do. So I think we need to start treating them as citizens and treating them as morally responsible human beings. And we need to start talking about them in those terms. Because until we do that, it's going to be very difficult to tackle this problem.